I'm Dom Nicholls, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as Ukrainian forces struggle against Russian manpower in Zaporizhzhya region, we report that Kyiv's Mayor Vitali Klitschko has called for the conscription age to be lowered. We bring the latest news on the corruption scandal at Ukraine's state nuclear power company, examine how significant it is that Kazakhstan has signed up to the Abraham Accords, and report on some odd goings-on in Russia, where Sergey Lavrov is seemingly back out of favour, the Kremlin has ordered the internet be permanently turned off around military sites, and Vladimir Putin has said he wants to see a special marriage agency set up for veterans of his war in Ukraine.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Wednesday, the 12th of November. 3 years and 263 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by the Telegraph's executive editor for audio, Francis Dearnley, and former Telegraph Russian correspondent, James Kilner. I started with the latest military updates in Ukraine. Let's go right into the Donbass feature of this week and last. Pokrovsk, no further advance as far as we can see. It looks like things have slowed. Certainly slowed, maybe completely ground to a stalemate in the city. Geolocated footage published over the last couple of days shows that Russia advanced in southern Pokrovsk, as expected, that is the open flank, and also made marginal advances in the southeast of Minarad, that's the town about 5 k's to the east. Now, elsewhere across Ukraine, in the south of the country, Russian forces hit the port of Odessa last night. It's thought at least 3 drones targeted port infrastructure there, hitting the grain terminal. No casualties or damage to ships reported. Russia is pushing elsewhere up and down the line, especially in Kupiansk in the northeast. That's in Kyiv Oblast. That is under extreme pressure. And along the southeast. So in Zaporizhzhya Oblast, Ukrainian Southern Defense Forces spokesperson Colonel Vladislav Voloshin said yesterday that Ukrainian forces had withdrawn from Uspanivka and Novomykolaiivka and from a few other positions, all northeast of the town of Huliapol. That's about 80 k's east of Zaporizhzhya city. So Colonel Voloshin said, "We've completely withdrawn from Uspanivka and Novomykolaiivka. There's very fierce fighting continues for Yablokove and 3 or 4 other locations. The defensive operation is ongoing, and the contact line remains quite dramatic," he said. Then late yesterday, Ukraine's Commander-in-Chief, General Alexander Syrsky, said the aggressor has increased activity in Zaporizhzhya Oblast, using weather conditions, dense fog, to infiltrate between our positions. He was speaking on Telegram and added that the situation has significantly worsened on the Alexandriivka and Huliapol axes, where the enemy taking advantage of numerical superiority. So Colonel Voloshin said a few other things. He said Russian forces had recently intensified artillery strikes in that area, firing roughly 2,000 shells in 400 artillery strikes per day. He didn't say what that had increased from, though. He added that Russian forces are taking advantage of recent foggy weather to use infiltration tactics to advance from the east, the same fog that Syrsky was referring to. Now, a lot of this reporting comes to the Institute for the Study of War. Now, they say Ukrainian military sources fighting in that southeastern area told Ukrainian outlet Suspilna that Russian forces are using the weather conditions in which Ukrainian drones cannot fly to advance in small groups on foot or on the motorcycles. They also report Ukraine's 7th Rapid Reaction Corps, part of the air assault forces, as saying that Russian forces have been exploiting fog that hinders Ukrainian drone surveillance. So this is their view, hindering Ukrainian drone surveillance in recent attempts to penetrate the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk on light vehicles. One Ukrainian brigade operating in the Liman direction, that's kind of north of Pokrovsk, which is in the east of the country, said that Russian forces are also taking advantage of the morning and evening fog to intensify offensive operations. Now, why do I go on about fog so much? It's because, well, for me, as a former soldier, fog is fighter agnostic. it is a cover. As a cover for movement, it offers the same advantages and disadvantages to both sides. So all these comments about how Russia is taking advantage of the fog, I just offer the thought that Ukraine is not also advancing as Russia is because of fog and the commensurate reduction on drone operations, because it must be affecting Russia the same as Ukraine, perhaps gives an indication of the relative strength of the combat power here we're talking about between the two sides, in particular the number of soldiers available to both sides, and or it speaks to the willingness to take risks with soldiers' lives. We know Russia doesn't really care about just shoving people forward and killing us. They don't care how many are killed as long as they go forward. Ukraine takes a different view. Now, is this a case of Ukraine can't take advantage of the weather conditions or won't? And are we seeing now a renewed Russian winter effort, having prepared the ground in depth for some months? We've been reporting about how Russia has been attacking Ukrainian logistic lines with drones, glide bombs, artillery, all the rest of it for months now. Perhaps, I venture, perhaps in anticipation of the predictable deterioration in weather conditions, which might be an opportunity for them to renew ground efforts. I wonder if we're about to see an uptick in ground assault along the line. Now, just on the number there, I said the disparity in combat power, and I highlight the personnel issues. There's an interesting article today in Politico. We'll put a link in the episode notes. They've done an interview with Vitali Klitschko, the mayor of Kyiv, in which they say Ukraine is facing a worsening shortage of soldiers as record numbers of men flee to Europe. Now, Vitali Klitschko has called for the lowering of the conscription age. He said, in the past, 18-year-olds served in the army, but those are kids. Right now, you can only be mobilized in Ukraine from the age of 25. He says you could lower it by a year or two to 23 or 22. This will be an interesting intervention. I think it will be controversial, but an interesting addition to the conversation. Now, as a reminder, in Ukraine at the moment, men aged between 25 to 60 cannot leave the country except with special permission. They must make themselves available for mobilization unless they have 3 children under the age of 18. So that means that a man aged, let's say, 40 with 3 kids, once the oldest child turns 18, although he won't be eligible for the draft, his 40-year-old dad will be. It completely turns on its head the old model of conscription. When we think about it from the Second World War and what have you, when an individual turns 18 and the family turn around and say, sorry, son, you're off to war. Now it's a question, in some cases, of a boy turning 18 and the family saying, sorry, dad, you're off to war. It is extraordinary what this society are going through and being asked to do. I don't make light of this about the numbers issue, but it is a very real issue. And I think that's an interesting intervention by Vitali Klitschko. What do you think? Now then, just to finish this one off, you'll be aware a government decree issued in August this year allowed men aged 18 to 22 to leave the country. That has coincided with a sharp increase in Ukrainians seeking protection in EU countries. And the most latest data that I've seen shows EU countries granted more than 79,000 new temporary protection decisions to Ukrainians just in September alone. Politico say that's the highest monthly figure in 2 years, with large increases recorded in Germany and Poland. This issue is going to go on and on and on. Elsewhere across the country, there were strikes this morning in Kharkiv. I was speaking to a friend there. She just left the city this morning as a drone strike was coming in. The mayor of Kharkiv, Igor Terekhov, said several dozen houses and a civilian transport enterprise were damaged. That enterprise is thought to be a series of warehouses belonging to a delivery business. Last I saw, 5 people have been injured. No reports, thankfully, of deaths there. But it's only happened in the last few hours. Across the country, 121 drones fired by Russia in the last 24 hours, 90 brought down by Ukrainian forces. Now, Russian telegram channels are saying that Ukraine hit a Russian-controlled thermal power plant in occupied Donetsk last night. Unverified photos on social media appear to show a large explosion and a fire late last night at the Zaporizhzhya plant in Novy Svit in occupied Donetsk Oblast. Ukraine's general staff said it did not hit the plant, but instead they say they'd struck an ammunition depot in the village near where the Zaporizhzhya coal-fired plant is situated. So we're not exactly sure what was hit, but something hit there. Also, Ukraine's general staff acknowledged a strike on a Russian oil refinery in the city of Orsk, that's in Orenburg Oblast. General Staff said late yesterday that they'd hit that plant for only the second time since the start of the full-scale invasion. They'd hit the crikey, I've been practicing all morning. Orsk-Neftekhzhynsk refinery. Anyway.
Brilliantly done.
Go to Ukraine, head 1,700 kilometres east, and you'll see a large smoking pile of something. Right, it's there. That strike caused the closure of the airports in Orsk and Orenburg, the oblast capital, and that's a few hundred kilometres west. That place was last hit early October. The extent of the damage there is still being assessed, Ukraine's General Staff said. And while the Russian Defense Ministry said it had shot down one drone over the area, local Governor Yevgeny Soltsev confirmed that an industrial facility had been hit without specifying which one. But I think we know which one. I'm not going to say it again. Now, moving on from Orenburg Oblast, but staying in Russia, Ukraine's Special Operations Forces said that they confirmed a successful fire attack. Sounds like old fire ships, but a successful fire attack on a Lukoil-owned petrochemical complex in southern Russia last night. This is the Stavrolen petrochemical enterprise in Budyonnovsk. That's 500 kilometres east-ish of the Kerch Bridge. It's right over near Georgia. It was hit by drones of the Deep Strike Unit of Ukraine's Special Ops Forces. Ukraine's General Staff said in a statement, numerous explosions and a fire were recorded in the target area. The results of the strike are being clarified. The Russian Defense Ministry said 4 of 22 Ukrainian drones brought down across the country last night. 4 were in the Budyonnovsk area, but it appears it's our old friend drone debris that caused all the damage. Stavropol Krai Governor Vladimir Vladimirov said on Telegram that the wreckage of drones that had been shot down had sparked the fires in the area. He said, according to preliminary data, there are no casualties, residential buildings have not been damaged, and life support systems are operating normally. Okay, that's us for the military updates. Let's turn to Francis. Francis, what's happening on the political and diplomatic front? Welcome back.
Well, thanks, Dom. Good to be back. I'll be brief today so we can get to Huddersfield's finest, especially because in tomorrow's episode, we'll be having a longer chinwag together about the all-day Ukraine forum at think tank Chatham House that we both attended yesterday. Just a quick shout out to all the listeners there that we spoke to and those that we didn't have a chance to. I'll come to updates on the corruption probe shortly, but I want to lead first with a story which speaks to the precariousness of the European position, given its dependence on the US and failure to forge its own strategically assertive posture in the first years of the war. Our friends at the Financial Times report that Russian presidential aide Yuri Ushakov held a one-off phone call with British National Security Advisor Jonathan Powell in January, just after Donald Trump took office, in an attempt to open a confidential line of communication with Moscow. This was London's independent initiative, backed by some European allies due to concerns about Trump's unpredictable stance on Ukraine and that it could sideline EU interests. Now, that call has now been confirmed by the Kremlin this morning, who say the conversation did not go well and failed to establish a regular line of contact. There really was a discussion, that's correct, Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told reporters, but the exchange didn't continue. Powell was very eager to explain the Europeans' position, but showed little willingness to listen to ours. Naturally, without the possibility of a mutual exchange of views, the conversation didn't go any further than that. I don't know quite why I've made him sound like a posh Englishman there, but anyway. A European official quoted in the report said that the worry was, we are outsourcing the discussions with the Russians to the Americans. And Downing Street told the FT it was normal for the UK to engage with Russia through diplomatic channels, but declined to say any more. Now, as I mentioned, this reflects the deep concern that prevailed in European capitals at the time, namely that the new administration might be willing to sacrifice Ukraine's interests. It was, therefore, seen as vital to develop alternative channels of communication beyond those between Washington and Moscow. That even then, such efforts between the two capitals were far more limited than they are today. Their attempt to forge that independent line of contact only underscored the earlier failure to establish one. And arguably that shortcoming still persists, despite some progress since. And we can explore that further in our discussion tomorrow, drawing on what we heard from experts at Chatham. Now, as an aside, speaking of the relationship between the British and the Americans, the Times of London has now confirmed reporting earlier from CNN that Britain's spy agencies and military has stopped sharing intelligence with the US about suspected drug trafficking vessels in the Caribbean Sea, with British officials citing their want not to be complicit in what they see as the extrajudicial killing of criminals by the US. Not strictly relevant to Ukraine, but that follows several European intelligence agencies, as we've already reported, limiting the exchange of certain information with the Trump administration in recent months, some more openly than others. So an interesting development. But staying on the US, the Kyiv Post report a surprise reversal that's alarmed Ukraine and its allies in the UN, with the White House pushing to strip language from a resolution that affirms the country's territorial integrity and condemn Russian occupation of Crimea and other regions, according to two people familiar with internal UN discussions. Now, just for context, the annual resolution has for years been a diplomatic mainstay. I think we've probably reported on it each year as it's passed. It reaffirms international support for Ukraine's sovereignty and documenting human rights abuses in Russian-held areas. Last December, the US joined 77 other countries in voting for the measure, which passed with 78 votes in favour. The text explicitly recognised Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty, condemned Russia's annexation of Crimea, and detailed the worsening human rights situation in the occupied territories. Now, Washington wants those references removed. Two diplomatic sources told the Kyiv Post that the US side is pressing for the resolution to be recast under the broader label of war in Ukraine, without references to territorial integrity or aggression. Western partners privately fear that the move could effectively water down the UN's most consistent annual rebuke of Russia and signal a sharp break from the bipartisan consensus that's held since 2014. This is another example of Washington walking away from Ukraine's core interests at a critical diplomatic juncture, one European envoy told the Kyiv Post. If the language goes, the message to Moscow is that the US is no longer leading the defence of international order. Diplomats from several European countries are reportedly lobbying the US to reverse course before the vote. And as the Kyiv Post writes in its analysis, for Kyiv, the stakes are high. The resolution lays the groundwork for future accountability efforts at the International Criminal Court and in other venues. The dispute comes just as the International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine presented its latest findings to the same UN committee. That's the one we covered at the time, by the way, concluding Russian forces are committing crimes against humanity, including murder and forcible transfer, through systematic drone attacks and deportations in occupied territories. While the US officials insist the change reflects an effort to make the resolution more inclusive and forward-thinking, Western diplomats privately describe it as part of a broader pattern, downplaying references to Russian aggression in multilateral settings. It's not about semantics, said one European diplomat involved in the negotiations. It's about whether the world continues to recognise Russia's occupation as illegal or starts treating it as a fact of life. So an interesting and very telling piece that we'll link to in the show notes. Just lastly, from me, an update on the big domestic political story out of Ukraine this week, the corruption scandal at the state nuclear power company. Herman Halushenko, implicated in that probe, has just been suspended from the job of Justice Minister after an extraordinary meeting of the Cabinet of Ministers. He was Energy Minister from 2021 to 2025 before being appointed Justice Minister in July. For all the context on this story, it's worth listening to yesterday's episode. Adley talked through it in great detail. Halushenko has since commented, "I'm not clinging to the position of minister and will not cling to it. I believe that suspension during the investigation is a civilised and proper course of action. I will defend myself in the legal domain and prove my position." Meanwhile, Halushenko's critics argue that that suspension is not sufficient. The suspension of the Justice Minister is not enough, said Anastasia Rodina, head of Ukraine's Parliament's Anti-Corruption Committee. Two ministers must either resign or be dismissed from their positions by Parliament. Now, as reported yesterday, this scandal is deeply demoralising for many of the soldiers serving on the front lines and, of course, the country at large. But it also underscores that real efforts are being made to root out corruption, and in ways that are damaging to the government in Kyiv, which explains why the presidential office was so keen to rein in the power of the anti-corruption bodies earlier this year, though we all know what happened when they tried to do so. So an evolving story, one we will, of course, return to again this week. But that's where we are, Dom, in terms of the top political stories.
Thanks, Francis. Now, let's have a chat. Let's have a good chat with our pal James Kilner, Telegraph's former guy in Russia, Caucasus and everything over there. James, delighted to have you back. Always good to pick your brains. There's a lot going on in your neck of the woods. It zips about a bit, so we'll take them one at a time if we may. But I've seen all these different stories and I need the Kilner Babelfish to explain them to me. So first of all, could we go back to last week, please? There was something that I saw that I stuck under the, I know that's important, but I don't really understand it. Kazakhstan signed up to the Abraham Accords, or Hamish, if you're listening, Hamish Breton Gordon, the Abram Accords, last Friday. Follows a string of leaders from a number of Central Asian states in the White House. What's going on here, please, James? It sounds like there's an increasing influence or effort by Central Asian states to get in with the Trump administration. And what are the Abraham Accords? Hi, James.
Dom, great to be back. Thank you very much for having me back on your show. Well, I'm very keen to flag this up to your listeners, basically. I'm not sure how heavily it's been covered by the Telegraph last week, but for me, I've been watching Central Asia, reporting on Central Asia for about 25 years, and I've never seen so much US attention towards Central Asia and indeed the South Caucasus, the other side of the Caspian Sea, as they're getting now. There was interest around 2001, 2002, when the US was launching its military intervention in Afghanistan, and in 2014 when it was withdrawing from Afghanistan. But really, other than that, there's been some oil and gas stuff going on and some infrastructure projects, but we've never seen this much US presidential interest in Central Asia and the South Caucasus. Your listeners will already know that these are former Soviet states. They've only been around since 1991. Russia and China really are the two dominant regional powers. Russia very much cultural, linguistic, security orientated. China very much economy orientated. The West have really been playing third fiddle in this region. But here we have Donald Trump last week hosted all 5 Central Asian leaders in the White House for the first time. Now, this was done on a format called C5+1, which was actually set up in 2015, but typically it's been run at a sort of Secretary of State level. Joe Biden did host it in 2023, but that was on the sidelines of the UN Assembly in New York. So this is a step change in interest. And this is typical Trump flattery, waving business deals around, et cetera, et cetera. On the Central Asian side, for them to go to the White House, sit across the table from Donald Trump and his senior ministers, etc., and pose and joke, etc., with the US president at a time like this, when they would typically be allies of the Kremlin, is a remarkable thing to witness. It comes off the back, if you remember, Dom, in August, when the Armenian Prime Minister Nicholls and the Azerbaijani President Ilham Aliyev were in the White House again, signing a peace deal over their long-running war, effectively, again being presided over by Trump. So Trump has been absolutely playing all the cards in this region over the last few months, culminating in many ways on Friday. So the day after the Central Asian leaders were in the White House all together, the day after the Kazakh president hung around for another day, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev hung around for another day and signed up to these Abraham Accords. The Abraham Accords, as your listeners will probably know, was one of the headline policies that Trump rolled out in his first term as president, whereby in exchange for improved relations, business deals with the US, Islamic states in the Middle East, Bahrain, UAE, and Morocco, North Africa, signed up to recognize Israel as a state. So Kazakhstan has been the first country, those 3 countries that signed the accords in 2020. Kazakhstan's the first country since 2020 to sign up to these accords. So the first country for 5 years, the first country in Central Asia to sign up to it. Now, that in itself is a remarkable departure. Also, what is going on here? Kazakhstan already recognized Israel as a state. It has done since 1991-92 after independence from the Soviet Union. What is it achieving here? In my view, it's really cozying up to the US, and the Abraham Accords is almost shifting from a sort of Israel support policy to a pro-US, not alliance, but pro-US statement. I'm not saying that Kazakhstan Kazakhstan has shifted its foreign policy entirely towards the US. It can't and it won't. It has to tread a very careful line with Russia and China, so influential. But it does have multi sort of lateral foreign policy, and it will talk about this very openly. And the war in Ukraine has given Central Asia a lot more space to explore this in the US context. And I think this is what's happening here, and this is very important. And the Kremlin has also noticed.
Fascinating. Thanks, James. Yeah, always good to dial us back in on the Abraham Accords. Love you, Hamish. Now, next one I saw, and this kind of rumbles on, James. Last week, there were these suggestions that Sergey Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, had fallen out of favour, had gone missing, not been invited to various meetings, etc., etc., etc. They were denied by the Kremlin, although he clearly was absent from a couple. And now it sort of went quiet for a couple of days, and it's reared its head again. Now, Russian media have sort of raised it, calling it fake news, referencing the BBC, etc., etc. Now, is this Russian media joining in on the current troubles that the BBC is going through, or are there actually questions now about where Sergey Lavrov is and what he's up to?
Well, indeed. I mean, Sergey Lavrov, since he disappeared from this now infamous Security Council meeting in the Kremlin last week, he's been quite prolific on, certainly in Russian media, giving statements about this, that, and everything else. Obviously denying that there'd been any rift, claiming that the talks with Rubio, his opposite number in the US, and the potential talks between Putin and Trump that were sort of at one point semi-scheduled to take place in Budapest last month had collapsed before his intervention. If you remember, Dom, one of the reasons that apparently he went missing from the Security Council was that his language had been overly harsh towards Rubio, towards the US, and that this had collapsed the talks. He's denied this. The Kremlin has also come out and denied this, which is very unusual. Like the Kremlin very, very rarely comments on Western reports about what's going on inside the Kremlin itself. So, it's been rattled by these accusations that Lavrov has gone missing. They've called it fake news. The foreign ministry official spokesman has called it fake news by, I think it was the FT, which reported on the story first. And yesterday on Telegram, the Russian embassy in London has sort of saying, well, all of Britain is full of fake news. So look at the FT reporting on Lavrov. Look at the BBC's reporting on Trump, a reference to the Telegraph's excellent story last week about how BBC has spliced together a speech by Trump. So it released a statement, the Russian embassy in London released a statement yesterday saying that there were systematic flaws in the BBC's reporting. It was ideologically dogmatic. The journalist ethics were absolutely, in the floor. There was a load of double standards. So clearly, this is a Kremlin counterattack, I'd say, to push back against British FT reporting about Lavrov apparently going missing and sort of blending it together with his criticism from the White House of the BBC.
Well, it's fascinating. I'm very interested if the Russian embassy in London is citing the Telegraph as breaking the story of alleged BBC fake news. If they're now using us as a trusted news site, delighted. Well, chaps, you can come and have a chat anytime you like. If you trust our reporting.
Are they still ignoring your calls, Dom?
They are. I've tried ringing them every couple of days. They just ignore it. Anyway, James, now for a number of, certainly months, if not years now, there have been reports of the mobile signal in Russia going down around certain high-powered events where Putin's going to turn up, and they're worried that there'll be some sort of electronic interference and et cetera, et cetera. But it seemed to be ad hoc. But now there's this story from Ulyanovsk of a more permanent switching off of the internet. What is that? Is it permanent, or is it just an extended period like the others?
So Ulyanovsk is the first region in Russia. Ulyanovsk is in central Russia, famed as the birthplace of Lenin. It's the first region in Russia to say it's going to turn off the mobile internet permanently, it said, or until at least the end of the war. The end of the special operation in Ukraine, as the euphemism is in Russia, around military sites and government buildings. But it also said, analysts have been saying, this is also going to impact nearby residential areas as well. So I would imagine the area that they intend to switch off the mobile internet is actually going to be quite large. Now, I think it's important to ram home this point to your listeners again, that this is a direct consequence of what appears to be an extraordinarily successful drone campaign by Ukraine to target refineries, industrial production sites, factories, military bases, etc., inside Russia. Now, the Russian authorities have really struggled to stop these drones. They, almost every day it seems we get reports of another successful drone attack inside Russia. The various regional authorities have been turning on and off the mobile internet all year to try and disorientate these drones, etc. I don't know how effective it is, but Ulyanovsk has clearly said or clearly decided we need to do it on a more permanent basis, and so they are the first region to do this. You can get a real sense of the panic, of the unease that the Kremlin is feeling around these Ukrainian drone attacks, Was it last week, or I think it was the week before last, where I came on and I was reporting on your podcast, Dom, about how Putin has signed into law rules that allowed regional governments to recruit reservists as mobile anti-drone units, basically. There's a big reservist army in Russia. Analysts say that this has been done. This is sort of a mobilization on the quiet sort of thing, but it's directly targeted at these drone attacks in Ukraine. There's now reporting that up to 20 regions in Russia have started pulling together these units of reservists to try and shoot down these drones with, I don't know whether they're using special anti-drone technique or shotguns or whatever it is. But there's serious unease in the Kremlin around this. And now we have Ulyanovsk going to turn off the mobile internet, the first region to do that. I would say these are quite serious consequences of Ukraine's effective drone bombardment.
Indeed it is, and whoever the reservists may or may not have been near the plant in Budyunovsk last night, obviously you're not going to get their monthly bonus. But speaking of shortages, I think one of the reasons, not only because these sites are undefended, but also one of the reasons they put these reservists in is so they can free up any other manpower to go to the front. But that's not the only sign of worker shortages I've seen around Russia. What have you been looking at there? Doctors I've seen. Is there a shortage of doctors?
There's a major shortage of doctors, Dom, in Russia. The pay is very low. The opportunities to migrate abroad are obviously enticing, but they're also in huge demand at the moment because they've got this huge flow of soldiers coming back from Ukraine in terrible psychological and physical state. So the Kremlin is now saying that young doctors who graduate have to do at least 3 years in a state hospital before they can move on, before they can do any work sort of privately. If they don't, they have to repay all the fees for their studies and they have to pay a very large fine. The Kremlin has also been sort of taking creative policies towards other elements of shortages. There's shortages all over the Russian employment system. And its prison service, I was reading last week in the Russian media, is now going to start recruiting foreigners, offering degrees in being a Russian prison guard. So I don't know how that's going to go down. That's one creative way that the Russian state's combating a shortage in prison guards. There was reporting, I think, earlier this year, if I remember correctly, where prison governors were saying they're 50% short on prison guards in Russia, partly because you can get paid so much more for going and fighting the Russian army. So major shortage there, then the Kremlin's trying to plug that gap. Putin is heading to India next month. I think he's meeting Indian PM Modi on the 5th of December. And the Kremlin is now leaking, or has been telling its propagandist media, that one of the main policies that Putin is going to sign with Modi, he's going to sign a policy to ease Indian worker migration to Russia, yet again, trying to plug this shortage. Once again, the Kremlin's firefighting all over the place. It's difficult to overstate that the Russian people are getting so nervous about this, the lack of people in the work system and the inflation it's creating, that the Kremlin is having to leak 2 weeks or 2.5 weeks ahead of a major trip to India by Putin, that one of his top policies is going to be about employment. That in itself tells you, so much of where Russia is economically, how much damage the war in Ukraine has done to its economy, to its worker system, and to its population. So I think, once again, a really interesting insight into what's going on over there.
Yeah, thanks, James. I know we're zipping about a bit, but we don't get you on often enough. So I'm squeezing the special sauce out of Kilner for all I can. One last one, please. The Lukoil. So the sanctioned Russian energy giant Lukoil. Big news over here. We've covered it a lot, but not being covered in the Russian media. Is that just a step too far, a bit too close to home? As you say, people starting to perhaps feel the impact, if not talking about it, feeling the impact of the war. Is that why they're not talking about Lukoil much?
I think the Russian population are savvy enough to understand that if Lukoil, one of the headline Russian oil companies, was getting a battering in the Russian media, then something was going incredibly wrong. As I'm sure you've been informing your listeners, new US sanctions on Lukoil have had a huge impact on Lukoil's overseas arm. It tried to sell its overseas assets to a Switzerland-based sort of Kremlin, vaguely Kremlin-linked, previously Kremlin-linked, coin it how you want, trading unit. The US basically scuppered that last week, said this unit was a puppet of the Kremlin. And since then, projects overseas have stopped working or on the point of stopping working because no one wants to risk being on the other end of secondary US sanctions.
Indeed. Well, thanks, James. Always a pleasure to chat. Do hang around if you're able to for final thoughts. We'll go to them now. Just a quickie from me. Francis mentioned it earlier, but we were at Chatham House yesterday. I moderated a panel. Thank you for everyone who came along. I'm hoping to get a copy of that recording, so we'll try and put that out in the future. Although being a very average journalist, I completely forgot how much time I had for my panel. I couldn't remember if it was an hour or an hour and a quarter, so I had to whisper to the audience about 45 minutes in, how much time have I got left? Not realise, of course, I had a collar mic on. But anyway, that's the kind of level of professionalism you get from me if you want me to be a moderator. Francis, what final thoughts you got?
Well, it was a good session, Dom, although when you said that, I think a lot of people thought, like, how much time have I got left? I think people sort of thought the Grim Reaper was behind stage.
Well, if you know the answer to that one as well, I'd be very keen to hear.
Anyway, it was very interesting. And as I say, we're going to be talking a lot more about the conversations that took place at Chatham in tomorrow's episode. Just a very quick one from me. As we mentioned in last week's newsletter and on air, we are rejudging, if that's a word, the newsletter to include more of your questions so that we can answer them. And as part of that, we also want to play your questions to us on the podcast at least once a week. We've already had quite a few come in from you. So just as a reminder, if you want to hear your voice on the podcast and be heard around the world, if you send in a clip of you saying your first name, where you're from or where you're dialing in from or recording from, and your question, please no longer than sort of 20 seconds or so. We just don't have space to do longer than that. Then we will try then and play them out and then answer them in that week's newsletter. That's our plan. It may be that there's a bit of a backlog, so it ends up being in future editions. But even so, please do send them into the usual address, ukrainepod@telegram at telegraph.co.uk. Maybe we should set up a Telegram at some point as well. And as ever, if you want to read the newsletter, do check out the link in the show notes to that. Tens of thousands of people do so, and they seem to really enjoy it. It's got maps and things like that as well. So yeah, thanks.
It's got maps. Brilliant. Thank you. James, as our guest, what would you like to say to leave our listeners with a few thoughts?
One follow-up on my earlier point about Central Asia is that Putin's actually hosting the Kazakh president in Moscow today. He arrived yesterday, Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. He's taking him to the ballet tonight, actually, Dom. So the point of of this little update is this seems to be a Kremlin response to Kazakhstan and Central Asian leaders being in the White House last week. Kassym-Jomart Tokayev, the Kazakh president, is being feted and charmed by Putin. He's having the red carpet treatment, literally, and the Russian media is talking about this. They're saying, well, look, I was in Moscow for 2 days rather than just one day with Trump. Putin's found time to take him to the ballet, etc. We really value Tokayev's friendship. And this is a major contrast to the way Putin used to talk with the Kazakh president. If you remember the first year of the war in Ukraine, 2022, Putin literally tried to embarrass Tokayev on stage at his various propaganda conferences and by garbling his name, literally. And now he's feting him as a great friend. So interesting sort of contrast there. And the other one was just a very small side story saying that the Kremlin's actually set up a dating agency for its veterans coming back from war in Ukraine, injured veterans, wants to matchmake them on apps and conferences, whatever, called the Orthodox Tinder, promoting traditional values. This is all about, once again, the Kremlin prioritizing its veterans over everyone else in Russia. So just a little interesting societal endpoint.
Brilliant. Thank you. I wish there'd been a veterans dating app back in my day, but anyway, never mind. Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Francis and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons, to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.